We'll stop it though when we get to the Q&A.
Yeah, no problem. And so just continuing with the agenda, focusing on some of those specific rights, right, related to culture, race, sex, and gender. And I know, unfortunately, right, a lot of us are here tonight because Penridge is going through maybe nearly all of these issues, right? Bathrooms and locker room access, preferred names and pronouns, culturally affirming dress codes, hairstyle, and grooming policies, who can and cannot participate on certain sports teams, right? Book bans, banning of pride flags, right? And things that create hostile environments, which we will break down. And I already covered this, just gonna pause really briefly for recording and for access in case people are unfamiliar. We are a statewide nonprofit, and we focus primarily on providing legal services. For most of you here, I think you'd contact our Philadelphia office, but there's also a team in Pittsburgh covering the western half of the state at the Education Law Center. So moving right in, our Inclusive Schools and Honest Education project believes that schools must be welcoming and inclusive for all students, that every child deserves an education that prepares them for success, that there's a safe place for learning that is honoring a student's history and their experiences. Research shows us, and students and families will tell us, that welcoming and inclusive environments that are giving accurate information allow young people to pursue their dreams and prepares them better to participate in democracy and society. Contrary to maybe what opponents might share, Education Law Center, we believe that schools should be inclusive of all backgrounds, not just some. So just moving to a second area that is touched on today is our Education Black Girls Justice Initiative. So ELC is the only Pennsylvania education law firm that has a specific work area that's focused on Black girls. And just some of those initiatives would be, investing time and resources, right? And implementing legal strategies. And really just the core belief that Black girls must be fully and holistically supported, affirmed, and celebrated. And so if anyone has not yet seen, we issued 2 weeks ago a report called Supportive Spaces, Black Girls Speak Out About Public Schools, and I just happen to have a copy. And so we have a couple hard copies. It's really just a beautiful report. There's 8 recommendations. It's available online. So that would be something that I link in the chat. And there are some paper copies for people that are want to come by or want to grab one, just let me know. And I hope that you'll check it out. Some additional kind of context moving into our work is really a landmark decision in the 8 years plus school funding case that was filed back in 2014. After 4 months of trial, the judge found that Pennsylvania students do have a fundamental right to education, and that the current funding system that relied on local property taxes resulted in negative impacts, lesser opportunities, and was disproportionate by race, and therefore was found to be unconstitutional. And I mention this as some background. I think a lot of the work and some of the solutions that we think about when we say, on one hand, not to be homophobic, right, and discriminatory and racist in schools. And then on one side is to also want to make sure that students in schools and teachers and staff have the resources and tools that they need to be able to support students. Too often we're finding that there is a have and have-nots system in Pennsylvania, particularly the state is one of the most segregated in the country, and that over half of the Black students in the state of Pennsylvania attend the most underfunded school districts. And so this is relevant when we talk about populations and communities that have suffered harm in the past, and how that harm persists into present day. And, groups that have been advocating and, thinking of intersectionality and all of the different things that when we say all children, that we are centering the students that are typically and historically underserved over the decades and unfortunately the centuries. So situating that and moving in, right, when we think of sort of what's happening now, when we see that school boards and states and local districts are proposing laws and policies that impact who has what rights, would be remiss if I did not mention that our country has a history of doing this, right? This is something that's happened again and again and again over time, right? So an example of that is Jim Crow laws, a collection of state and local statutes that essentially legalized racial segregation. And they impacted and lasted for about 100 years. You'll find some people that say they still exist, right? They're not completely done and gone with, right? We have informal, unwritten expectations that impact, Black families and Brown families and other communities, right? And we saw some of those results, right? Separate schools, whites only, overcrowded schools, leaky roofs, sagging floors. These things are related to funding, and they're also related to historical context, right? Limited access to books. And that's just like ironic now, right? It's like we have access, we're going to roll it back, right? And ban books instead. Students without desks. Does this sound familiar? Right? Sort of seeing history repeat itself in real time. There is a lot of context in this area. Jumping all the way forward, right? We saw some progress in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, right? Women coming into the workforce, people of color, in organizations and corporations acknowledging, right, systemic racism. Like maybe there was a problem. Maybe we can do something about it. DEI trainings, right? Everyone is so-called woke culture, right? And that's now being attacked, right? Stop woke acts and such like that. We saw a, huge racial reckoning, akin to what we saw in the civil rights era back in the 50s and 60s. And then we see former president calling out things like critical race theory, right? Issuing executive bans on racial equity training. So we had a lot of progress. We had things are turning around. We can do this post-racial society and all of those things, and immediately rolling those things back, right? And then we're seeing President Biden reverse those bans, right, for federally funded trainings, right? Issuing statements that support LGBTQ students. We're seeing again the backlash, right-wing media, and I don't need to tell anyone here this, right? Because you're seeing it right in your backyards. Historical numbers of bills, historic levels of book bans across the nation, but particularly in Pennsylvania, right? Where Pennsylvania has come out as the top 2 or 3 state that is, enacting such policies. And so just kind of jumping back and then moving forward, thinking about in the 80s and 90s, as a response to the HIV and AIDS epidemic, states began to enact laws prohibiting instruction on LGBTQ issues in public education. This is not something that has been lost, right? This is something that's still in effect, even in 2021. Right? States that have policies on the books that prohibit instruction on LGBTQ issues. Texas is a state that prohibits LGBTQ issues in education and sexual education programs. These are active policies, right? And this is where I tie back in things like Jim Crow, right? It's been outlawed, it's been declared illegal, it's been declared wrong. separation is good and those kind of rhetorics, right? No promo homo laws or don't say gay bills and such. And we're seeing a return. So I kind of covered this. So just going to move forward about recognizing book bans, right? So a book ban occurs when a school administrator or personnel removes or restricts student access to a book that was previously available based on that content, right? So that's one of the more broader definitions. Remove or restricts, kind of if we're focusing on that word, not necessarily through a policy, right? Could be formal or informal book bans. And some targeting or some, key language, right? Sexual conduct, implied depiction of sexual acts, language that maybe someone finds offensive, focusing on a particular incident, particular word or words, passages, without taking the full, merit or context of the book into consideration. So that's some background. I'm going to keep moving for, time purposes and get into our laws. So knowing your rights about which laws are protecting which rights, focusing on our 3 levels, right? So the blue being federal, right? Our US Constitution, equal protection. We have Title IX, we have Title VI, Title VII, right? And then Pennsylvania has a state constitution and an agency that regulates, making sure their folks are not discriminated against or retaliated against. We also have our school code that outlines some of this for states and school district expectations. As many of us know, Pennsylvania is a very locally based, right? 500 plus school districts, each, different school boards, local school board presidents, and individual decision makers making up a board. And then we have those school board, school district policies and local municipal non-discrimination policies. So there are, tons, right? Just needing to kind of highlight a few of these so that people are able to revert back. And then we'll spend some time, doing a deep dive. So Title IX is goal is to offer strong protections against sex discrimination. And I'll define that in just a bit, but this is an act from 1972 and the educational amendments, and it protects people from discrimination based on sex in education programs or activities that receive federal financial assistance. So that would be public schools, that includes charter schools, it includes certain approved private schools, right? Placements where students may be placed publicly by their local school districts to attend. And who is responsible for upholding those rights are our local state, local education agencies, or LEA, state education agencies, SEAs, and other institutions that receive federal assistance from the education department federally. So the issues covered would be sexual harassment, failure to provide equal athletic opportunities, sex-based discrimination in courses and programs, how pregnant or parenting or expecting students are treated, treatment of LGBTQ plus students, discriminatory discipline, and lastly, a hostile environment. So claims or issues, if you're thinking any of these things, you're thinking most likely Title IX. So hostile environment, which we'll cover later, but just briefly now, what does that mean? It is conduct that is sufficiently severe or pervasive or persistent to the point that it's interfering with a student's ability to receive a benefit or to participate wholly or in part from services offered by a school. This is same for activities, for opportunities, and all school districts are required to have at least one person designated as their Title IX coordinator, right? So if you're filing a complaint, you have a point person at your school. This person's responsible for providing information, supportive measures, explaining the process, explaining grievances, the rights that you have in terms of the complaint. They're not going to necessarily, I won't say necessarily, they won't help you with writing or filing, but they'll support you in making sure that you can get your questions answered. Title IX also involves some rulemaking. So also sex-based discrimination, right? So sex stereotypes, sex characteristics, pregnancy or related conditions, sexual orientation, gender identity expression. And there is some development in this space. So there was public comments that closed, some recent Title IX regulations that are coming down. Even I think just was that last week, 2 weeks ago, the Education Department has released now separate rulemaking related to athletics. And so understanding that the context of this, the Biden administration and the department have been pretty clear with, statements and guidance in their proposals that they are intending to, enforce Title IX and be consistent. That includes and that's that, it's a acronym, sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. The pushback on that, and I would say, the opponent argument is that people want to narrow it just to biological sex, right? And so the difference here is that it's more inclusive than that. It's not just biological. That has been settled for some time. And so what's happening is that is being primarily strengthened, right? And so the proposed regulations related to athletics would, if a recipient, meaning a school district, is adopting or applying sex-related criteria that limits or denies a student's eligibility to participate, and understanding that we didn't always have male or female team, right? That is a decision that's made. I can just speak from my own personal experience that I went to a high school that only had one lacrosse team. What does that mean? That means that it was a co-ed team. It means I played lacrosse with boys, I would say, and girls, but some of them quit despite my efforts to recruit girls, enough girls to get off the co-ed team and get our own. That didn't happen. But recognizing that the criteria and grade level, following some criteria, right? So being related to achieving a educational objective, thinking through what educational objective is being served by excluding students. And another important objective is to minimize harms to students. Thinking particularly of those who would be limited or denied. So ELC actually submitted comments yesterday. And so those will go up probably soon on our website and social media. We're joining, a lot of the other national organizations in this work to call on these, rulemakings to be not just adopted, but strengthened and eliminating some of the loopholes that we have concerns about. We also have the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act. So this is our state level anti-discrimination law. Discrimination in public schools, public accommodations are included, is prohibited, and particularly for race, right? And race includes hair texture and protective styles. It includes color, sex, which is, like I said, including gender identity, expression, and sexual orientation, religion and ancestry, national origin, as well as handicap or disabilities. Little bit caveat there. I know not our focus for today, but having a record and having an associated relationship, support animals are included in this. And so over the years, the PHRA has really expanded to be more explicit in naming types of discrimination. They are ultimately charged with making sure all people in Pennsylvania live, work, and learn free from unlawful discrimination. there are some new regulations. So this past December, they have adopted final regulations. Discrimination based on sex, again, includes sexual orientation and gender identity. Why does that sound repetitive? Because our state is falling in alignment with what the federal government has already said. So if it was unclear on a federal level, if it was unclear on a state level, that should no longer, exist. Discrimination based on race, again, is including things that are historical or cultural, and that includes hair texture and protective hairstyles. We're, going back to the supportive spaces report that I mentioned and showed in the beginning, this is a particular area, I would say, of concern, and I'll give some examples in the slides coming up about what that may look like. Okay, and then just a few different areas. So related to both Title IX and the PHRA regs. So exclusion or discrimination of transgender and non-binary students are violations, right? And we're seeing those pop up in a number of different contexts. Bathrooms and locker rooms, right? So you cannot discriminate against trans and non-binary students by requiring them to use bathrooms and locker rooms that do not match their gender identity. I know that this is coming up all across the state. It's happening. Districts are passing policies. It is a violation of not just state law, but federal law. What schools can do is provide a gender neutral bathroom, but then they cannot then require, again, someone to use that particular space. Typically, it's offered sometimes as safety, right? Safety measures, whereas trans and non-binary students may not be restricted from going into the bathroom, the girls' bathroom, or whatever choice. But if it would not be safe to do so, school providing, accommodations for them to be able to use the bathroom somewhere on campus. The Third Circuit has rejected arguments that school policies protecting transgender students would then violate other students, right? So if you're protecting transgender students, are you now violating the rights of other students? No. And so there are a number of cases in this state, in our different districts, that are supporting trans students' access. Moving, and I was like pausing also, sports teams, right? So multiple courts have addressed this issue and have held that excluding trans students from sports violates the law. This is not as strong, right? And this is the area where I was just saying EOC submitted comments about how to strengthen this. Obviously, and maybe not obviously to some, but a complete ban on students, trans students being able to participate is very clearly discriminatory. What AOC has been concerned about is that the regulations may allow schools to create new types of sports teams, right? Like, oh, this isn't male and female, and we've kind of come up with some other way to categorize this that gets what we want, but isn't an explicit ban just against trans students, right? Because if you write that, it's too obvious. If you come up with some other sort of loophole, then maybe. And so we want to make sure that does not become a result of regulations that are not clear enough. Pronouns and names. So again, these are rights that transgender and non-binary students have. And so intentionally and persistently misgendering is sex-based harassment. It does create a hostile environment. And this is for, right, teachers, staff, students, etc. So a public school teacher does not have a First Amendment right to discriminate in their classroom. In terms of what students have raised, right, as being outed, and school districts have said, we have a right to tell parents certain information. There is a right to privacy. There is no mandate or requirement to notify parents of a student's preferred name or preferred pronouns. You also can selectively deny to not use a trans student's preferred name. And then if someone is like, hey, I know my name's Michael, can you just call me Mickey? And the teacher says, sure. and then someone says, please, you're dead naming me, please stop using that name, here's my preferred name, and the teacher says, nah, I'm going to keep calling you what's here on the roster. That's a clear example of discrimination, right? You're agreeing to do it for some students, you're denying to do it for other students, you're disproportionately impacting trans and non-binary students. That is discrimination. Hostile environment, which is going to keep coming up, and just worth reading, right? Again, because that is a lot of the time what the basis of litigation and complaints will center on. And so defining what is severe, what is pervasive, what is persistent, how many times is too many times, right? What's our limit in terms of where we feel like this is going over the threshold. This is starting to be unchecked harassment, right? Discriminatory policies, i.e. prohibiting pride flags. It can be, determined to have created hostile environment, particularly when you think about the impact, right, of having something saying this is no longer okay and removing it. That creates an impact on students that felt affirmed by, for example, pride flags. And I'll just add, to do that and then also pass a discriminatory or, possibly discriminatory policy, those two things together also tend to create hostile environments that can strengthen claims. So Title VI, moving on a little bit, racial discrimination, right? So this is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It protects people from discrimination based on their race, their color, their national origin, and it specifically focuses on educational programs and activities. Again, that caveat of receiving federal financial assistance. And so public schools, yes. Cyber schools, yes. Cyber charters, yes. Other, LEA state-run agencies, that might be the intermediate unit, right? That could be that approved private school, and those other kind of public placements that get federal funding. The issues you'll see relating to Title VI are racial harassment, school segregation, racial disparities in programs and courses, technology, discriminatory discipline, which is prevalent and rampant here in Pennsylvania, as I think a lot of us know. And then there's that term again, right? Hostile environment. So in this instance, again, there's conduct, right? That could be physical, verbal, graphic, could be written, and it is severe to the level that it's interfering with someone's ability to participate. Racial disparity in programs and opportunities. In some instances, right, where you have a segregated state with somehow, not on purpose segregated schools as a result of people's zip codes, right, where people live, where people can afford to live, where people have property. And that in turn dictates sometimes who is at the schools. So schools that are serving students of color sometimes are less likely to offer advanced courses and gifted and talented programs or have the tools and technology. This is something that came up in the school funding trial, right? And the court has determined that that is disproportionate, right? That there's an unconstitutionality in terms of saying if you can't afford it, you can't have it. And so to think of it in kind of a funding context, and then obviously in this space about excluding certain clubs, excluding certain students from being able to organize, particularly groups that have been marginalized and discriminated against in the past. And then because it's worth saying, diversity and inclusion does not violate Title VI. Generally, diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings and activities are consistent with Title VI. And so, for example, there is no prohibition on teaching on the impact of systemic racism, right? Being culturally competent or attempting to get non-discrimination trainings. When there's an issue, being able to, right, investigate and issue reports. And reports can opine that there's a racial disparity in a school. Using specific words in school policies or activities, right? And it's fun, not so fun fact, but all of the words I'm getting ready to read are on a list of like CRT words to watch out for. And some of these words have been banned in different districts and schools, right? So words like equity, discrimination, inclusion, diversity, systemic racism, right? Oppression, institutionalized racism, and such terms. Some districts and organizations have called these terms out as being, CRT or reverse racism or other, concerning arguments that I'm sure folks have heard. And so this was just the statement, the fact sheet that's been issued by the Office of Civil Rights, which will be included and is linked in the slides that will go out. School rules, as I've stated, sometimes perpetuate discrimination, right? And they do so on the basis of race and sex. This, again, to just come full circle, right? Like Jim Crow laws were the law and they were wrong. I think a lot of people have now acknowledged that. And so to recognize that there are still instances of this in today's times, right? Black children are most over-disciplined group of students across all pockets, right? When you look at all of the different factors, it plays out essentially the same. However, there's no evidence that Black and brown children are just breaking more rules. But there is evidence to show that they're more likely to be punished for it and punished more harshly, and that this begins really at the outset, right, in preschool. And that some of us will say school to prison pipeline, preschool to prison pipeline, right? And that's some of the impacts of, discriminatory policies and or the application of those school rules. And then we have LGBTQI plus students punished also more often and more harshly than their peers, again, despite following the same rules at the same rates. We do know that students that identify as LGBTQ are suspended at twice the times of rates as peers that don't. We are also seeing, what does that mean, right? Suspensions, meaning missing more days of school, being pushed out of schools and into alternative programs, homelessness, dropout, prisons, and so on, right? Because if students are not in school, where did they go? School dress codes may also be discriminatory, right? So the way dress codes are enforced can also push students out of school and have a unique harm against Black girls and students that identify as LGBTQ. This is just issued even as recently as a report, just about a year ago, that education departments, should provide information on equity and safeties and dress codes, right? So schools that are having such harsh and strict dress codes are typically found to have more Black and brown students in those schools, and Black and brown students being more likely to be removed from class. The GAO's Office of Accountability analyzed national data, and they found that 4 out of 5 predominantly Black schools and nearly 2/3 of predominantly Hispanic schools are already enforcing these strict dress codes. This is compared to about 1/3 of schools that are predominantly white. And policies that have been purported to keep students safe have actually been demonstrated to cause harm, right? Cause push out, cause feelings of unsafety, being targeted, and other related instances. One, just in the report was looking at it, required sometimes students to be touched, right? To measure something or to assess a student's clothing or to ask them to remove something or to require them to put something else on. Those sort of practices and those requirements of such practices can be traumatizing and triggering and creating harm within itself and literally undoing what is supposed to be creating a safe environment. Safe for who, one might ask. And I said I'd come back to it. So just some examples. These are hyperlinks. These are words from school codes and policies across across the state. Hairstyles that are innovative or flamboyant, hairstyles that are not well groomed or neat, hair that is colored or highlighted, um, curly high tops and high top curly fades, even such things as prohibitions on excessive parts or prohibiting use of cultural hair jewelry and more. Um, I think I probably have a hairstyle now that has excessive parts. And what does that mean? That means I can be written up at school, I can be suspended. If there are repeated violations, right? If I don't go home and take my hair out and come back with something different, it will be considered a repeated violation that can lead to, as I mentioned, exclusionary discipline, suspension, and often, unfortunately, expulsion, right? You can be expelled for not having the proper hair at school. ELC recently represented a family. I'll double check, but it may be in our article that yes, the students dyed their hair brown, right? They were a blonde student that dyed their hair brown, and that was impermissible, and were facing expulsion. Yes, that was what the school found to be a good use of their time. Discriminatory dress codes, right? So saying that earrings are only for female students, requiring female students to wear skirts, prohibiting them from wearing pants, and other, discriminatory sort of sex-based violations. These rules send the message to students, and I put students with an asterisk, right? Because I think we're understanding that this is disproportionately impacting certain types of students that fall into certain classes, particularly Black and Brown students, particularly LGBTQ students, and it creates feelings of being unwelcome and unwanted. And again, done under the guise of safety. So moving and then kind of going more specific. So I spent some time already on bathroom and locker access, right? And so this is just worth sort of repeating, but I'll move a little bit quick through this section. And so just, I think I mentioned it about bathrooms and locker rooms before, that you cannot discriminate against trans students by requiring to use a different bathroom. It's not something that can be required. And there is that Third Circuit case that I mentioned, along with a few other supportive findings for trans students. Again, the Department of Education, Office of Civil Rights, has made it clear that they will enforce the Title IX interpretation, keeping sex and discrimination to include gender identity and expression, and listed out a couple cases where this has been applied, right? So Dorchester County School District was found to have violated Title IX when they prohibited a trans student in elementary school from using the girls' restroom and required that student to use the bathroom in the office or the nurse's restroom, right? That was found to have violated federal regulations. There was another case, Downey Unified School District, that there was an agreement, right? So they're going to allow trans students to use female designated facilities and treat girls as girls, right? And not make those, discriminatory distinctions. This resolution between the district and the complainants also included amending policies and procedures, right? Training for their staff and faculty, age-appropriate instruction for students, and then supporting students who had experienced harassment, right? So that was in 2014, right? It's almost like we're moving backwards today in 2023. And again, I covered this, right? But just repeating it, that it's discriminatory to deny to use a trans student's preferred name while at the same time agreeing to a cisgender students to use their nickname or their preferred name. Teachers do not have a First Amendment right to discriminate in their classrooms. This is not considered to be compelled speech. Schools have a compelling interest and a responsibility to protect students from discrimination, right? And I know We have students and advocates here that are seeing their schools and their school district do the exact opposite, right? Put certain students over others and just causing, discrimination results. So ultimately, right, these efforts can be life-saving. In the Boyerton case from the Third Circuit, they expressly recognize that, quote, transgender students face extraordinary social, psychological, and medical risk, and the school district clearly had a compelling state interest in shielding them from discrimination. And we know that school-based supports can save lives, right? There's a number of not just studies and reports from organizations such as the Trevor Project, and other, academic journals, right? But real communities and families will tell you that sometimes, feeling safe and feeling affirmed in school is literally the difference between life and death, right? And we're seeing that students testify in front of school boards are repeating those same, kinds of things. And in some instances, it is the difference that tips the scale. And it is, reported that at least one space, right, was going to reduce the odds, right, of any suicidal attempts. So there's some time. I'll move a little bit quick through this because this is the part that I was saying is linked, and I don't want to people attended that. Not that it was last week or anything, and everyone was supposed to memorize every complaint option and every word. And so move a little bit quick, and then happy to go back if I miss things. So just some key terms. I think some of these are kind of straightforward, but a complainant is the complaining party. They're reporting the discrimination. And so this is, that's the technical term. People will switch it, right? Parents, student, plaintiff, depending on if it gets to that level. And the complainant is filing, right? And the respondent needs to respond, right? They're the ones that's being accused of the discrimination. This is typically going to be your school, right? Or your district. The investigation is where the complaint is being looked into. Depending on who your, investigator is, they may conduct interviews, right? They may pull records and news reports. They may go in and observe. And then they may try to find resolution for the parties, right? Mediation. This is a conversation with the facilitator where we're trying to reach some kind of agreement. And a lot of these instances lately, I think that there's such polarization that you sometimes have a school district that is completely unwilling to hear what the complainant is saying. And I think that's a lot of what families have been feeling, and not all the time, right? There's been a lot of success stories on a, case-by-case basis. I know what a lot of us here want to see are wide sweeping reforms, right, that impact the whole district, where the district stands up and takes a stronger stand, where you don't have to complain or sue for them to do the right thing, to get that remedy, right, an outcome to address discrimination. This could be individual, as I mentioned, right, one person seeking this one thing from my one child, systemic, where it is, like I mentioned before in one of the settlements, right, everyone on the staff got trained. Everyone at the school was able to access mental health resources. The bathroom was changed, right? The policy was changed. Staff is being informed on how to deal with the problem differently next time. Those would be more systemic. And then there could be a hearing, right? A formal process. This looks different depending on where you're filing, which I'll hopefully get to in just a bit. Ways to support students through a complaint process. And students, right, is almost like with an asterisk. Typically, you'll see parents or organizations filing. But firstly, affirming the student, identifying the harassment. This is illegal. This is wrong. You have options, right? Too often we are telling our young people, well, it's better than it used to be, right? We're making progress. I was bullied, it's normal, it's fine, they're not beating you up, right? It's just mean words. let the rain hit your back like you're a duck, or, different fun things that are not so fun when young people hear them and they want support. Identifying who's involved, right? Not necessarily their name and everything about them, but general information and descriptions. You can still report something. You don't need to know, where to find them, for seventh period or anything like that, or their home address, right? What grade are they in? It was in science class, Mr. Bob was teaching and it was raining that day. It might have been a Tuesday, right? Like, what details do you have, right? And really, whenever possible, typically when something happens, you're not like, oh, goody, let me write everything down and take a bunch of pictures because I'm going to file a complaint, 90 days from now. That's not typically what we're thinking when something horrible or, traumatizing, or when harassment is happening. But, seeking medical care, documenting the, cause of injuries, consulting with an attorney, and I would even say an advocate, right? A family friend, I don't know, a Title IX coordinator, about how to preserve messages, and places where this can be stored, and the best way to do it, so that the student isn't completely left on their own, right? Safety plan. Maybe we're not at the point of filing something. Maybe something was filed very recently. The problem is happening, right? The problem already happened. The problem is repeating itself. I need supports now. I can't wait for this investigation to take a year, right? And so this may include, separation between students, a modified schedule, a transfer, the ability to participate virtually or move to another classroom, to get counseling. There's a lot of options. And I think what I would just say is, feel free to be creative, right? I think this is an area where schools recognize they can do something in the meantime, and that often if they don't, that there can be consequences that happen later on. And then, ultimately seeking support, right? And I know that we're gonna cover some of those resources today, so I don't want to take up all of the time. Just quickly, I'm actually just gonna go through the agencies. And I think people know, but just making the distinction again, Office of Civil Rights, federal, right? We're looking at sort of big level, race, national origin, disability, retaliation claims. These are claims typically against all of the different ways that schools can show up. So the agency itself, vocational schools, libraries, again, the U.S. Department of Education is giving federal funds. If you're being discriminated against, they want to know about it. If that entity or, is not getting federal dollars, their, ability to take action is more limited. And then just highlighting the timeline here, that this is 180 calendar days. It is from the last act of discrimination. So if something happened today, and then something happens a month from now, the month from now is the last act, right? It wouldn't be today. And there are some waivers for good cause. We have, again, the PA Human Relations Commission. This is our state entity, right? And then, so this is also including, right, individual complaints, agency initiated, and it includes our schools. It covers a lot of the same, classes. And I'll just go to the next slide. Timeline is similar, right? Filed by the person who is the victim of the discrimination, is sometimes the distinction, and also recognizing that this is more broad than just schools, right? So housing and employment complaints are also brought here. I won't go through the specifics of the PHRC complaints, but I will share those resources. Same with OCR requirements. What I want to get to is it's important to document, right? I just kind of went through this. There is a checklist that, can be shared, right? But trying to be as specific as possible. Who acted, who was there, who knew about it, what did they do once they knew, right? And even I think, what did you do, right? Like I sent, I called, I left a message, I sent an email, I called a meeting, I testified in front of the school board, right? To demonstrate that someone is on notice. If slurs are being used, being specific, right? Reporting the behavior when it happens and creating that paper trail, right? I learned, and I feel like I should have known this a long time ago. I was like, oh, great, I found the bullying, investigation form. I feel like a lot of times parents will say, well, are you going to investigate? And the school's like, yeah, we're looking into it. And then, time goes by and time goes by. What's the status? What's the status? And there's no answer. And a lot of the times, a formal investigation is not underway. But what you can do to ensure that is to, if the school district has a specific form that they're requiring, right? They don't want an email or a phone call, which they should still be taking seriously. But to use their form and send it in the way that they have, dictated and documented it and dating it and saying, I notified you by email here. I followed up again here. I filed this form here. This form says you're going to do something within 30 days. What is the status? And escalating that, right? Keeping your receipts, keeping it in a folder or any way that feels good of organizing it, right? I know even particularly social media, right? Screenshotting and bookmarking, right? And sending it to someone else, and just kind of better building up that case. One last tip is school districts sometimes will respond by phone. When they respond by phone, making sure that you're emailing. Thanks so much for speaking with me today about the bullying complaint I filed 6 months ago. It was nice to hear that you're doing the following things. You said you would send me a status report by next Friday, blah, blah, blah. I am going to be at the next school board meeting. I hope to hear from you soon. I'm still waiting on an answer about a safety plan for my child. I hope that we can meet soon. Everything that you kind of went over, what you're asking for, what they said they would do, who's going to do it, when. It sounds like a lot, right? And maybe you don't get every single thing, you don't check every box, but just making that kind of effort and making that paper trail is super helpful. And I know that, the next presenters are also going to cover that. So just lastly, some partners in this work, right? So Ed Voters, we have our statewide sort of coalition that we've been building up, having sort of roundtables and supporting parents, learning about what's happening on a statewide level. There is a listserv, there's a Facebook group. Locally, right, we have Advocates for Inclusive Education, Central Bucks. There are tons of Facebook groups. Some of them are a little scary. Some of them are public and scary. And you can just search and you can scroll all the way down and get your inside scoop. Campaign for Our Shared Future, ACLU, and FIRE are other groups that we've worked with to coordinate letters or responses or complaints. And so lastly, and feel free to screenshot or share, again, this will be shared out, but ELC resources and contact information, our website, probably if folks haven't already, I saw people in the chat, I'll do a data dump of a bunch of links that I said I would share throughout. And then just generally, right, the work that we're doing is both sort of reactive right now, but ELC is hoping to, really work with partners, get on the proactive side of things, and turn this into something that is really, like we say, right, inclusive schools and honest education, welcoming places for our students. And that means all students, not just some. So thanks everyone so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Ashley, for everything that you just shared. I was sitting over here taking my notes myself. You reminded me of a few things to make sure that I do as well. And I hope that the students and the teachers and parents that are on the call felt this to be beneficial as well. There were definitely things that you mentioned that I didn't even put in the categories, right, of harassment or discrimination, or things that you could take action against. So I hope that everyone found this to be beneficial. So I don't want to take up too much time. I want to make sure that we give enough time to Professor McClellan from the UPenn ARC Clinic.
So first, I just have to echo that was such an excellent and informative presentation, and also want to say in particular thank you to both Adrian and Laura for gathering us all. This has been, so inspirational to hear different people's point of entry to this conversation, because I think it really shows the opportunity for when folks come together to really make change and be strong in the face of what is pretty unabashed attempts to further marginalize communities that have been marginalized in these spaces. So really glad to be here. Just to briefly introduce myself, and I'm gonna try to leave most of the time for us to have questions and conversation, because I really would like to hear from you all, and for this to be not just a lecture but a conversation tonight. But I'll briefly introduce myself, and I'm hoping there's Alexis. I was looking through the gallery. Alexis could also introduce herself. So I'm Kara McClellan. My pronouns are she, her. I direct the Advocacy for Racial and Civil Justice Clinic at Penn Law School. We provide legal resources and representation for folks who are organizing for racial justice, or who have other civil rights claims. And so we work in the areas of education equity, economic justice, and we have a practice area that's called ending over-policing and mass incarceration, where we actually just settled a major lawsuit against the police department here in Philadelphia. And just a little bit about my why, because I really appreciated that folks were sharing that. I think it really helps as we're just meeting each other to really understand where everybody's coming from. So my why is really the students that I taught. When I taught middle school, I taught in West Philadelphia. I taught in a school that was racially segregated, that was economically isolated. Many of the issues that Ashley was talking about in terms of underfunding and racial segregation were playing out in my school. And so I went to law school, really wanting to get at the root of the policies and decisions around funding and decisions to maintain a racial apartheid system in our country that were impacting my students day to day before they even showed up to the classroom. So after law school, I became an attorney at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. I worked on school desegregation cases, if you can believe they're still ongoing in many parts of the country, some of which were filed right after Brown v. Board. And I also worked on school discipline, including representing 4 students, Black and Latina girls, who were strip searched at school because, as the principal said it, they appeared hyper and giddy because they were laughing after lunch. And so I think it's just a really, a microcosm for the types of racial and intersectional bias we're seeing playing out in school discipline, many of which Ashley was also just talking about. I also worked on the affirmative action case that's now before the Supreme Court. And so at the clinic, what we are doing is really training students who are about to become civil rights lawyers on how to really bring a racial justice lens to their work. And so in particular, in our education equity work, we're concerned about how we can use the existing tools under the law and through administrative complaints to address systemic inequities in education through Title VI and through Title IX. So what we thought we would do tonight is to talk about a couple different examples of systemic challenges through civil rights complaints. And one of the first, I think it was actually the first complaint to challenge book banning and anti-CRT laws was in South Lake, Texas, and that it was a complaint that I brought. So I was going to talk a little bit about that, And then we were going to talk a little bit about what's going on in Central Bucks that I'm sure you all are familiar with. And then we'd love to hear from you all, your questions, your ideas, ways that maybe we can be activated together. So let me pass it to Alexis to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. My name's Alexis Dickerson, and I'm a summer intern for the Race Clinic. I graduated from Spelman last year, and I'm currently a rising 2L at Penn Law School. My pronouns are she, her, and my why is I've always been extremely passionate about any type of advocacy issue. I think it's extremely important that everybody has access to the same legal knowledge. And this entire meeting just reminds me of my high school experience and protesting for gender neutral bathrooms and the dress code, and really brings me back.
So I'm going to share my screen. We will, as I said, be brief so that we can get to discussion. This is just a little background, and you can see the students from the clinic this semester have been doing tremendous work. And let me click ahead. So Alexis, do you want to provide us with kind of the national picture as we've been talking about it?
Yeah, so just getting into national statistics, as of 2021, there have been efforts in 36 states to restrict education on racism, bias, and the contributions of specific racial or ethnic groups to US history or related topics. Over 17 million students currently are going to schools where there have been attempts to block so-called critical race theory. That's 35% of K through 12 students in the country, and 900 total districts across the nation. So what we're seeing now emerging are that there are consequences on students' opportunities to learn. And then specifically looking at Pennsylvania, there have been at least 56 attempts to restrict access to 302 books in Pennsylvania. The state is currently the second in the nation for the most attempts to ban books, and the group Moms of Liberty is actually hosting their annual summit in Philadelphia. They have more chapters in the state of Pennsylvania than anywhere else in America.
And as folks in Penn Ridge will know, that doesn't even include shadow book banning, right? Which is one of the most troubling aspects of many of the issues we're talking about tonight, is the lack of transparency. So as I mentioned, I worked on the complaint that was filed with the Department of Education, challenging the hostile environment that existed in Southlake, Texas. This complaint is ongoing. But I wanted to talk about how, in addition to the individual complaints that Ashley just went over the process for, it's also possible to challenge a systemic complaint on behalf of multiple individuals or even organizations. And so that's what we did in Southlake. We made the case that what was happening in Southlake School District was not simply an issue of one student facing harassment. It was systemic. And just to give a high-level summary of the facts in Southlake, right? This was a school district that is, known as Ground Zero for CRT. I don't know if any of you have listened to the podcast or the documentary that NBC did, but it was one of the first places where there was, at the school district level, organizing to try to ban books and to roll back the DEI initiatives that were in place. It was also a district where there had been multiple incidents where students using racial slurs and yelling the N-word had gone viral. And so the school district was, and we're just kind of going through the components of what makes a hostile environment, as Ashley just talked about. The school district was on notice, number one, because they had heard from parents directly about the harassment that students were facing. It was severe, right? Second element, in that it was slurs and other types of serious, not just, we're not talking about students making harmless jokes. We're talking about discrimination, harassment that is based on sex or race and those are protected categories. When you get into those categories, it's not just bullying, it's the type of harassment that can rise to the level of discrimination when it's severe and pervasive. The school district was also on notice because students had organized and created a website documenting testimonies of different types of harassment that students in the district had experienced, and they actually went to the school board and shared this information. So there was a clear argument that the school district was on notice that this was not a one-off, it was repeated, it was systemic. And instead of doing anything to address the harassment, the district was doing the opposite. It was taking away the resources that we know are a buffer to prevent discrimination and harassment. So some of this may sound familiar. The school district, in addition to removing the DEI initiative that was existing beforehand, also started removing learning materials through the online drive where students were able to access books. The school district also was responding instead of providing trainings or support by actually limiting what resources teachers could provide to students. And so we made the argument that when a school district is on notice, what they're required to do under Title IX and Title VI is to address the discrimination and ensure that it doesn't happen again. And what this district was doing was the opposite. It was actually removing the resources and the remedies that are necessary to address discrimination. So we had severe and pervasive harassment going on in the district, and we had a district that was on notice and not taking the required action to redress the harassment that was ongoing. So that's kind of at a high level. I can put in the chat a link to a summary of the complaint that was filed. But what's important also is that in Texas, SB 3 had passed, which prohibited trainings related to race or sex and prohibited schools from teaching that individuals, as they put it, by virtue of race or sex is inherently racist, right? So this is the language that's now been tracked in different so-called anti-CRT policies and laws across the country that tries to suggest that addressing systemic racism or teaching about inequality and the history of inequality and discrimination today is banned, when in reality, often the language that's used is that it's harmful to individual students, but the research is very clear in showing that teaching about discrimination and having honest conversations about history is actually a buffer to ensure all students are more safe, is actually preventative of discrimination and ensures that there's a safer environment for all students. And it is also critical to students developing critical thinking and other skills as citizens in our country. So that's one example of a complaint that was filed, and I'm happy to answer questions about that or put more information in the chat. The Department of Education has, as Ashley talked about, released some guidance since this first round of complaints was filed, but there has not been a decision from DOE on one of these yet. So likewise, you all are likely following the Title IX complaint that was filed in Central Bucks. This is a complaint similar to the South Lake complaint. It's focusing on discrimination based on sex under Title IX, and it alleges that the district has a chronic failure to take reasonable and necessary measures to address persistent and severe harassment of LGBTQ+ students, and the result is a hostile environment. So the publicly available version of that complaint we can also put in the chat. You all may be more familiar with that complaint. And ultimately, what it asks the Department of Education and the Department of Justice to do is to order Central Bucks School District to take the measures recommended and well known and based in research by the DOE for supporting transgender and gender nonconforming students in order to eliminate the hostile environment. So, it's not like districts have to guess about what to do because there's research and there's information and there's guidance readily available on on what will actually ensure that that there is an inclusive environment, and what they need to do to comply with the law to ensure that there's not a hostile environment that pushes out students. Ultimately, as Ashley talked about, hostile environment law, a claim exists that can be viable when a district has not responded to the harassment, and as a result, students are prohibited from accessing their education. So that could be things, unfortunately, like has been talked about tonight, where a student feels so unwelcome that they actually decide to leave the district. That is a clear hostile environment case. But it could also be things like a student not feeling comfortable getting on the bus anymore. That's not being able to access transportation to the school. It could be things like students not feeling comfortable going to the after school program, or a student feeling like they can't participate in lunch anymore because of the bullying that's going on. So anytime what was happening in South Lake, for example, was that students were having to make the difficult choice between, do I want to stay in this district that I pay taxes for, and that is an academically, excellent, district to attend, if the condition is that I have to undergo this harassment all of the time, this discrimination based on my identity. And no student and no family should have to make that choice. And that's why Title IX and Title VI exist, because it's recognizing that this form of harassment is a form of second generation discrimination and exclusion based on race or sex. So I want to open it up to questions and discussion, but I just want to really emphasize that the thread we're seeing through all of this is really a response, as Ashley talked about at the beginning of this conversation, to those who recognize that marginalized students are gaining the language and the power to talk about what they've experienced and to combat discrimination. And so this is not only a First Amendment issue, but it's also a discrimination issue, because attempts to remove books and policies to try to silence students are actually an attempt to keep us from having honest and truthful discussions. And it has no place in schools, but also on a more hopeful note, it's happening because conservatives who are concerned about conversations about institutional racism and systemic racism recognize the power that our young people have when they have access to this information, and also recognize that we are living in a more diverse country, and in a country where students who have had to hide their sexual orientation or other aspects of their identity are no longer willing to hide, and they're threatened by the numbers when we come together and organize. So I just really want to lift up that the organizing that's going on across this country is really giving me hope, and that although it can be really difficult and scary to come forward, coming forward as a group or an organization, and not just on your own, can be a way to ensure that there is some protection and some strength in numbers, so to speak, because there's so much more that we can do together.
So thank you so much, Professor McClellan. Again, very insightful, very informative information that I hope everyone on the call, is able to connect to, and maybe start to think about those next steps, right? What are those actions that you might want to take? How does this how has this and how does this impact you and your family or your students? And so we want to give some time just to open it up for questions. And so if anybody has any questions and would like to unmute, we have a small group. So if anybody would like to unmute to ask a question or to make a comment, please feel free to do so.
I did see one in the chat earlier about that we have lists of books that have been banned. How can we get help with this? I know I put in the chat about something I just saw from the last school board meeting around things being labeled and they're obsolete. And I stated what I've been doing, trying to track down information, is usually you get the runaround. So how can we go about this?
So I'll say on our end, we are tracking everything that is happening in Pin Ridge. We actually have an entire timeline documenting everything that's happened so far. So we would welcome additional information because, frankly, there's so much happening in Pin Ridge that it's hard to keep track sometimes. So I'm going to put in the chat a link where you can share your information if you'd like us to reach out directly, but you can also put different concerns in there. If there's a concern about, kind of securely sharing information, we also have secure share links that we can save if folks want to upload different lists or examples of documents.
Thanks for sharing that. Thanks for that question, Ed. I did see it in the chat as well. Anyone else have any questions?
I'm just clarifying a question to the last one. Is it that there's a list of books that have gone through a review process and they've been determined to be not acceptable and they've been pulled? Or was it like, where'd that book go? It was there yesterday. Is it formal or like informal removal of the list of books?
Is Jane still on here? No, it looks like she dropped.
Oh, was
So
that
it was,
the
yeah, it was from Jane. So there were two parts that I've noticed through my time here is there's one thing with somebody put in the thing about a current lawsuit about the school would remove all copies of a book by saying checked out, or another one was marked as being lost. So I know there's a something going on with that already. But at the last school board meeting, there was a list of books that were buried under obsolete items. And some of it were removed from the high school library, like these old encyclopedias and stuff like that. But when I dug in and started reading the list, I started seeing some of these books like The Perks to Be a Wallflower, some other LGBTQ books that have been targeted, and even some things that they just don't like the message in there and so forth. And I'm trying to get an answer as to why, because they can't just point. I said, you can't just point me to policy 109 because it's very vague. It includes curriculum material and all these other things, where I thought from the 1982 Supreme Court case ruling about, while schools have a lot of control over curriculum materials, they have a lot less control over the library materials and they can't remove it. So
right?
I want to know under policy 109, the reason you're removing this specific book. I'm trying to make it very easy for them to give me an answer. Are you calling it obsolete? What are you calling it that you're removing this? Because it's not an old book.
Yeah,